Yes, sir. What's your
How's it
name?
going? I had a question about the moral argument.
Yeah.
So this is what I wrote. How does God's view of what's best for us solve the problem of objective morality? If we compare what is good and bad according to the nature of an infinitely loving God, then what makes God's loving nature inherently good? If it's God himself who defines his nature as good, then on what basis? Are we not just dealing with the same problem of trying to understand why is it good to be good and never truly having an objective starting place when it comes to morality?
The student is wrestling with one of the most fundamental challenges in moral philosophy and theology, whether morality is truly objective if it is grounded in God's nature. His core concern was whether appealing to God as the standard of morality avoids the classic dilemma. Is morality good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If goodness is simply based on God's nature, then isn't that just an assertion rather than an objective foundation? Is there a truly immovable standard of morality, or are we just defining good as whatever God happens to be? Essentially, he was trying to push beyond theological explanations to see if Frank Turek's moral argument actually provides a solid objective starting point for morality, rather than just assuming God's goodness without external justification.
Yeah, good question. I think the reason that we say God is good is because what all philosophers and theologians mean by God is the ultimate good, whatever that is. Okay? So when we say God, probably what we ought to do is take the word God just out of our vocabulary for a minute, because we all have maybe different conceptions of what we mean by God. Think about it this way. Who is the source and sustainer of all things? Think about that. Who is the source and sustainer of all things? Where did all this originated and how is it being sustained? Who's doing that? Whatever that is, whoever that is, that's what we mean by God. And the buck has to stop somewhere. It stops at the nature of this source and sustainer of all things. So when we say God is good, good is a positive quality. As I mentioned earlier, evil is a negative quality. Evil can't exist without good. Good can exist without evil, but evil can't exist without good. So ultimate reality, the source and sustainer of all things, can't be by definition evil, because evil requires good to exist. So the yin and the yang don't work.
So basically we're just defining the ultimate source as what is good?
We're saying that whatever good is, that's what we mean by God. God is the standard of good. Now, how would we know about this God? He can reveal himself in a couple of ways. He can reveal himself through his creation, or he can reveal himself by inspiring people to write more details about him. And I think he's done both. He tells us about himself through his creation. We can see his qualities through his creation and also our conscience. And he gives us more details through written revelation. That's how we know who God is. And the way we can be affirmed that the God who created all things is the same God of the written revelation is that the written revelation lines up with what we know about the natural revelation, and God intervenes in miraculous ways to confirm that the people who are speaking for him are truly speaking for him. So God does three things. He creates, he sustains, and he intervenes through miracles on occasion.
I get what you're saying about how we can learn what, like Yahweh specifically has in store for us and what he thinks is good.
Right.
But I'm failing to understand what makes his opinion objective.
Well, it's not his opinion, it's his nature. See, there has to be a standard that's immovable, that is what we call good, true, right, just. All those attributes have to be somewhere, and even Plato recognized this. He put them in forms independent of God. We're saying those forms, if you want to call them forms, are God's nature. All right?
Thank you.
Good question.
The student's line of questioning reveals a deep engagement with the Euthyphro dilemma, a philosophical puzzle that has challenged theologians and philosophers for millennia. At its heart, the dilemma probes the very foundation of morality and its relationship to God. It presents two seemingly irreconcilable options, Either God commands what is good because it is inherently good, or something is good because God commands it. Each horn of this dilemma leads to significant problems for the traditional understanding of God and morality. And the student's questions skillfully expose these difficulties. The student's concern centers on the potential arbitrariness of morality if it is simply defined by God's will. If goodness is good because God commands it, then it seems to follow that God could have just as easily commanded the opposite, and it would then be considered good. This makes morality contingent on God's preferences, rather than grounded in some inherent quality. Imagine, for example, if God had declared theft or murder to be good. Under this divine command theory, those actions would suddenly become morally praiseworthy simply because God willed them to be so. This undermines the very notion of objective morality, as it makes right and wrong dependent on God's subjective and potentially changeable decrees. Morality becomes not a reflection of some eternal and unchangeable truth, but rather a reflection of God's current whim. The student's questions demonstrate a clear understanding of the implications of this divine command theory. He recognizes that if God merely defines goodness, then the statement God is good becomes a tautology, a circular definition that lacks any real substance. If good simply means what God commands, then saying God is good is equivalent to saying God does what he commands, which is trivially true but doesn't tell us anything meaningful about God's character or actions. It doesn't explain why God commands certain things and not others. It reduces goodness to an arbitrary label attached to God's preferences. The student is searching for a more robust foundation for morality, one that avoids this pitfall of arbitrariness. He is not questioning God's existence, but rather the nature of goodness itself and its relationship to God. He seems to be yearning for a framework where morality is both grounded in God and yet also possesses a degree of objective reality, existing independently of God's subjective preferences. He wants to understand how God's commands can be more than just arbitrary pronouncements, how they can reflect a truly good and righteous nature, rather than simply creating goodness by fiat. He is, in essence, grappling with the challenge of reconciling divine sovereignty with the inherent sense that some things are just plain wrong, regardless of who says so. His questions are not meant to be antagonistic, but rather to genuinely explore the complexities of this issue and seek a coherent and satisfying answer. He is looking for a basis for morality that is not simply God's say-so, but something deeper and more intrinsically meaningful.